Usually get it wrong. So yeah, firstly, thanks for having me here. It's great to be joining this workshop, and thank you also for doing the global time zones. That's yeah, really fantastic that different continents can join. So yeah, I'm Hannah Dawson. I'm a physical oceanographer and postdoc at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. But today I'm going to be talking about some work that primarily some work I did during my PhD looking at along shelf connectivity. But given that this is the Antarctic Peninsula workshop, I'll focus it on that region. And then also talking a little bit about maybe some of the physical implications of that connectivity. Right, let me try to advance the slide. Okay, that advanced. I've got two screens going here, so it's a bit confusing as to as to what's going on, but I think that's advanced. So yeah, this concept of connectivity is obviously very well known for everyone online today. But back when I started my PhD, I was sort of noticing that the degree of connectivity on the Antarctic shelves as a whole was not particularly well constrained or even understood, despite regional signals like freshening in the Ross Sea commonly being attributed to meltwater from the Amundsen Sea, for example. And also despite these very well-known, although poorly observed, currents, the Antarctic slope current and the coastal current that transport heat, nutrients, salt, and organisms around the Antarctic margins. And yeah, so these are just schematics from Becky Beadling showing the approximate locations of those currents. I'm sure that doesn't need an introduction here, but also a very nice idealized cross-section of these currents on the left, demonstrating that they're both sort of these typically surface intensified, although in some regions the slope current is bottom intensified. And so during my PhD, I became quite interested in trying to understand along shelf connectivity around the Antarctic margins, both from a sort of strength and timescale perspective, trying to understand just how connected different shelf regions are, over what timescales they're connected, and if there's any implications of that connectivity. Great. So to answer this, we turned to ocean modelling, and Matt gave a very nice introduction to some particle tracking in the talk earlier. So we used a 1/10 of a degree ocean sea ice model. I won't go into much detail, but you know, it's not coarse resolution, but it's also these days not, you know, high resolution. It comes with a myriad of caveats in that it doesn't have things like ice shelves or tides that are really important. So I'm certainly not trying to make a statement as I go through that these are definite pathways or timescales, but this was really just to kind of get a broad understanding of connectivity between different shelf regions and a sort of maybe mean state approximate estimate of those timescales. And so we released particles along these transects across the continental shelf, represented by the black lines in the figure on the left. I hope you can see them, they're pretty thin. And these particles were released, you know, from the surface down to the bottom of the ocean every day for a year. And we tracked these particles forward in time for 20 years, trying to get at some of these pathways and timescales. And the animation on the right is just included for illustrative purposes. It's just showing a very small subset of these particles released at 5 different locations on the shelf and their trajectories over the following couple of years. And although it's a 2D animation, these are being tracked in 3-dimensional. So it's got the full depth ocean velocity fields from this model. Okay, so if we let's look at connectivity at the peninsula. So again, the figure on the left is just including it for illustrative purposes. It's showing, again, a very small subset of particles that were released along this blue transect in the western Weddell Sea shelf. And so all the coloured lines represent a different particle trajectory. And you can see that all of these particles are basically heading north, either in the coastal current on the shelf, which quite strongly follows the bathymetry, or in the slope current near the 1,000-metre isobath. Those particles reach the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Most of them then turn west into the Bransfield Strait, and a lot of them also recirculate cyclonically within that Bransfield Strait before exiting the shelf region. These trajectories that you can see here off to the right, they're actually particles that have fully recirculated within the Weddell Gyre in that 20-year timeframe of this simulation. But if we compare this to some of the known pathways of ocean circulation in this region from surface drifters, we can see that we are replicating quite a lot of these features, which gives, some confidence in the model. We do see this extension of the coastal current southwest from the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula towards the Bellingshausen Sea, which might get back to Carlos's point about, perhaps this model is a bit leaky, as you say. But certainly in this model, this coastal current has a weak but present extension of this coastal current to the West Antarctic Peninsula. And instead of looking at individual trajectories, we can grid these, bin all of the trajectories into this sort of gridded format. And that's what's shown by the shading in these figures. So this figure, it's really hard to see any detail. So I'm just showing a zoom. The red box is just outlining the zoomed in inset to the right. Wherever it's a dark color means there's more particles that travel through that particular grid box. Wherever it's a lighter color, there's less particles. And I was interested in the along shelf pathways. So I'm only showing trajectories until the last time they leave the continental shelf, which is why you don't see any of this bottom water pathway, but that is there in the simulations. And yes, you can clearly see in this sort of gridded view, these meandering pathway along the continental shelf itself and this pathway along the slope current near the 1,000-meter isobath. The particles entering the Bransfield Strait, turning right, many of them turning right at the end and exiting at this location, or turning northwards, I guess I should say. Exiting at this orange arrow here, and also at these two other locations. So the vast majority of the waters that are sort of originating on the Weddell Sea in this model are leaving the shelf at these three locations. But as I mentioned, we do have this weak extension that heads towards the Bellingshausen Sea and continues on into the Amundsen. And we can quantify the strength of this connectivity by looking at the volume of water that these particles represent reaching the West Antarctic sector. And in this study, the West Antarctic sector includes this sort of what would typically be called, I think, the Western Antarctic Peninsula. So again, we can see most of the water in the Weddell Sea will pass through the Antarctic Peninsula before entering the sort of broader Southern Ocean circulation. Very little of that will continue westward, about 5%. Whether that is more than you would expect in the real ocean, I don't know, would be very keen to chat about that. It sounds like potentially, yes, that is a stronger connection than we might otherwise expect. Okay, and in addition to looking at the pathways, we can also quantify some of these timescales. So that's what's shown in the figure on the bottom here. The dark colours are faster transport timescales, the lighter colours are longer transport timescales, and I would say that our confidence in these timescales diminishes as the time is going on because there's sort of less particles that are used to quantify that particular timescale. But we can clearly see that there's this kind of quite rapid advection along the shelf in the Weddell Sea, with the waters entering the broader Southern Ocean circulation at the peninsula, either into the Antarctic Circumpolar Current or the Weddell Gyre itself. But it takes, on the right, I'm showing a histogram of transport timescales. So it takes particles that were released across the shelf at the red dot about a year to reach this region indicated by the blue star. And then it takes them about, roughly another 5 years to make it around the peninsula down into the Bellingshausen Sea indicated by this yellow star. And you can't really see that histogram on the right because the percentage of particles that are making it all the way around is so tiny. But that's the timescale of those particles that do, at least in this model. Another way to look at that is by looking at the locations where the waters last leave the continental shelf, and that's what's shown in this figure. So at the top, we have the locations separated into different density classes where waters are exiting the shelf for the last time. And the middle panel is just showing the sum of these exit locations regardless of their density. And so clearly the Antarctic Peninsula stands out as this sort of really strong export location, or this sort of confluence site of waters reaching the peninsula and then exiting into the Southern Ocean, open Southern Ocean. And we kind of made the interpretation from this that the circulation at the peninsula or configuration there is acting as a quasi-barrier to the propagation of along shelf anomalies. But in hindsight, I'm not sure that that's the best interpretation because, if we trust some of the modelling work, at least, I'm very happy to discuss that more as well. It sort of suggests that even if you have a weak connection, changes to that connectivity can drive, remotely drive changes to shelf properties. I think, a better way to think about it is that changes to a baseline connectivity, even when that connectivity is relatively weak, can be pretty important for driving downstream or remote dynamical processes. And to illustrate that, I just want to go back to this study by Del Morrison that Carlos, I think, showed on day one and that Becky Beedling also nicely covered yesterday, but I just want to talk about it in a little bit more detail. And so during Becky's talk, we heard about how you get these cooling signals that appear on the Western Antarctic Peninsula in response to these simulations where you add meltwater, at least in a model that has a good or strong representation of the slope current. And this cooling is driven by the meltwater, which shuts down or reduces dense shelf water formation in the southern Weddell Sea and sort of enhances advection along the shelf. The southern Weddell Sea being, like this region down here in orange. And so Adele had noticed this in several of these modelling studies and found this in-phase time-lagged relationship between temperature anomalies, detrended temperature anomalies on the Western Antarctic Peninsula in blue, and dense shelf water production in the southern Weddell Sea over the preceding 4 years in orange. But obviously, there's a really nice correlation between these two time series, but obviously a correlation doesn't mean anything on its own. And so she nicely showed using these tracer experiments. I hope these figures, I don't know if they're coming up as incredibly blurry for you, but I hope they're not too bad.
They look bad.
Yeah, okay. They're very clear on one of my screens and very blurry on the other, so apologies if that's the case. But anyway, she very nicely showed that when you increase your fresh water, you shut off or reduce your dense shelf water formation, and you get this increased concentration in tracer on the Western Antarctic Peninsula that leads to a distinct cooling signal. Conversely, if you decrease your fresh water and you increase your dense shelf water production in the southern Weddell, of this advection around the shelf, and you get warming on the Western Antarctic Peninsula because the offshore circumpolar deep water, warm circumpolar deep water is playing sort of a relatively larger or more important role. And so the study's kind of demonstrating that, at least in the model world, dense shelf water production in the southern Weddell Sea can remotely drive substantial changes in shelf temperature along the Western Antarctic Peninsula via this connection. But I think it's important to note as well that part of this signal is driven by the dynamical response of the coastal current. So when you add fresh water, you're accelerating that current, and it's actually also transporting a larger volume around the peninsula. So it's not just this sort of transfer from a dense shelf water export to a long shelf advection. It's also an increase in that advection. But I think this does raise this, if we move away from the meltwater framework, and if we trust that there is this connection, which maybe is to be discussed, then it's kind of implying that interannual variations in dense shelf water formation and export could drive variability, not just necessarily in response to a freshwater forcing. But as far as I'm aware, this relationship or signal is something that's only seen in model simulations and not observations. And whether that's because this coastal current doesn't have such a continuous connection in the real ocean, whether that's because there's limitations in the bathymetry of the model, I don't know. We could chat more about that. But I think it would be really interesting to see if any kind of that relationship could be observed. And doing so would be incredibly challenging because, the Western Antarctic Peninsula might be relatively well observed to some other regions of the Antarctic coast, but we don't really have long-term time series of dense shelf water production in the southern Weddell Sea. We can maybe get at that via satellite-derived estimates of coastal sea ice production or sea ice production within the coastal polynyas there, but that production is not necessarily all indicative of dense shelf water formation. And so also the sort of signal to noise ratio, if this is present on sort of an interannual timescale, might be weak, that you can't really distinguish that from variability in that region anyway. But I think it would be interesting to see if that does exist in the observations. And I want to make the point that this kind of relationship between dense shelf water changes in one region and a downstream cooling signal is also seen in other regions of the Antarctic shelf in some model simulations, meltwater model simulations. So it doesn't seem to be something that is specifically unique to just this location, implying that maybe it is, there is like some mechanisms at play. Yeah, okay, and I just want to end on some summary thoughts. And they are that, many sectors of the Antarctic shelf are well connected. Outside of the Peninsula and West Antarctic region, I think that long shelf connectivity has sometimes been overlooked. And the risk of this is that, and overlooked in favour of, I guess, studies exploring cross-shelf exchange. And the risk of that is that regional studies of the shelf, and again, I'm thinking here about modelling studies, might miss important upstream drivers or preconditioning signals, and such as like changes to sea ice production that might result in a salty or fresh anomaly propagating along the shelf. And while we absolutely need regional studies, and they're not going anywhere, I just think that this does need to be kept in mind. And also I don't think it's necessarily just the strength of connectivity that is important, but changes to that connectivity over time that can result in these downstream variability, particularly if that change is occurring in tandem with an acceleration of either the slope current or the coastal current. And yeah, the modelling studies suggest that dense shelf water variability in southern Weddell Sea can drive this, remotely drive this shelf temperature variability in West Antarctica via this coastal current connection. Demonstrating this link or not demonstrating it with observations would be, I think, great or interesting at least to explore. And yeah, that's all I have for today. So thank you for listening.